Now we're jumping over to World Prehistory and Archaeology again by Dr. Michael Chazan, 4th edition, Pathways Through Time, 2017 edition. We're going to talk about villages and their emergence in the Middle East. It's going to be in 3 different parts. Part 1 will cover the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran period and the Natufian period as well, from about 25,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago. Part 2 will cover the early Neolithic or the early Stone Age. That dates from around 12,000 to 8,500 years ago. And then we'll cover the late Neolithic period of 8,500 years ago to 7,000 years ago in part 4. Briefly, in the thumbnail of the video is the chronology of the transition to agriculture. This is the chapter on different perspectives in agriculture in the villages of the Middle East. Without further ado, let's go ahead and begin our reading. In the Middle East, the domestication of plants and animals took place within the context of large villages. After reading, we will understand the emergence of settled villages in the Middle East, the domestication of plants and animals in the Middle East, the relationship among domestication, villages, and technology in the development of agriculture in the Middle East. And we will also tackle some questions surrounding and concerning the spread of agriculture to Europe. The ancient mound or tell of Jericho is a powerful lure to archaeologists. The famous walls of Jericho toppled in the biblical book of Joshua are exactly the type of concrete evidence that archaeologists should easily be able to identify and recover. The British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon sank massive trenches through the tell of Jericho, documenting the stratigraphic sequence and revealing the history of the site. Surprisingly, Kenyon recovered no evidence of a settlement dating to the biblical period. Why these remains are absent is unclear. Perhaps the story of Joshua is more myth than actual reality. Or maybe the settlement of Jericho described in the book of Joshua was in a different, as yet undiscovered location. But be it as it may, as Kenyon penetrated the deep archaeological deposits at Jericho, she uncovered a wall and a tower that astounded the archaeological community. And again, Jericho is one of the oldest cities of all time. And of course, she uncovered a wall and tower that astounded the archaeological community. The tower at Jericho during the excavation, you will notice an excavation or an opening rather in the top of the tower that leads to a stairway. These constructions were far older than that of Joshua's time or biblical times indeed. In fact, they were the oldest known monumental architecture ever discovered. The tower and wall at Jericho were built 12,000 years ago during the early Neolithic period. The Tower of Jericho is only one of a string of discoveries that have shed dramatic light on the origins of agriculture in the Middle East, at least archaeological discoveries in the 20th century, not to mention the ones that have been found in the 21st century. This wall was built 12,000 years ago, so approximately around 10,000 BCE. We will examine here the shift from hunter-gatherer to cultural or agricultural societies in the Middle East. The domestication of plants and animals in this region took place within the context of large and dense villages. The adoption of agriculture resulted in a transformation of all aspects of life. These profound changes affected not only social relations between people, but also the way people conceived of the supernatural. And in the last section, we explored the spread of domesticated plants and animals into Europe. Setting the scene, we talk about the Middle East, which includes a wide range of climates. A ribbon of Mediterranean climate extends today from Israel and Jordan in the south up into Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon in the north, and into northern Iraq and western Iran to the east. Together, these regions form an area known as the Fertile Crescent, characterized by dry summers and winter rains, with enough precipitation to support vegetation ranging from woodlands to open park woodlands. Again, Fertile Crescent is a ribbon of Mediterranean climate that arcs across the Middle East. It is characterized by dry summers and winter rains, with enough precipitation to support vegetation ranging from woodlands to open park woodlands. And so, along with trees such as oak and pine, large strands of wild cereals, including wheat, barley, and rye, dot the countryside. And to the south and the east of the Fertile Crescent, the Mediterranean open park woodlands grade into steppe environments that in turn grade into true deserts. The archaeological record clearly shows that the shift to an agricultural way of life in the Middle East was a process rather than a revolution. The transition to agriculture can be traced through a number of stages, and as you have seen, we have the different stages being the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran, the Natufian, the early Neolithic, and the late Neolithic. And so we see that the Neolithic was not necessarily a revolution. It was a revolution in the sense that it was something that heretofore had not existed, but between the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies, constituted mostly by villages, we see that it is a stage, and there are 4 stages in this process of around 10 to 20,000 years. Concerning political borders in archaeology, politics and archaeology frequently intersect in the Middle East. Sites like Masada, where a group of Jewish rebels made a futile last stand against the Roman army, have become powerful symbols for the modern state of Israel. As Palestinians reach for statehood, archaeology has also been an important tool for exploring identity and asserting a presence that has often been overlooked or even suppressed. In Jordan, archaeology has a strong sponsorship from the royal family. The Syrian government has used traveling exhibits of archaeological finds as an opportunity to expand the narrow perspectives Americans hold about their country. Prehistoric archaeology, including the study of the origins of agriculture, has relatively little political significance, however, but this does not mean that prehistoric archaeology has escaped the influence of politics. Even Stephen Rosen has shown that national borders have had a major influence on the reconstruction of prehistory of the region, even though these boundaries were irrelevant for ancient hunter-gatherer and early farming communities. The modern borders strongly affect where archaeologists can work, and even to an extent where they can visit. A United Nations diplomat tells of having breakfast in Tel Aviv, Israel, lunch in Amman, Jordan, and dinner in Damascus, Syria, before getting back to Tel Aviv after dinner. All of this travel was possible thanks to a diplomatic passport. However, an Israeli archaeologist who has lived in Israel his whole life is in fact unable to visit Syria, and a Syrian archaeologist who has lived her whole life in Syria is unable to visit Israel. The result, however, is a lack of communication and a fragmentation of the archaeological record. There are cultural groupings in the Epi-Paleolithic that closely map onto national borders. These are modern impositions, modern constructions, and conventionalities on a prehistoric landscape, filters that distort our view of the past. The signing of a peace agreement between Israel and Jordan has eased travel between these two countries, but ongoing tensions and outbreaks of violence, especially now in the 21st century, have kept interaction to a minimum. Nonetheless, the increased ease of travel has led to an improved understanding of the connections between Israel and Jordan in prehistoric times. The influence of national borders on our view of prehistory is not unique to the Middle East. However, it is simply heightened and evaluated and thus more visible in this politically sensitive region. Prehistoric archaeologists have a neutral interest in open borders. In many ways, the emphasis on understanding local archaeological developments from a global perspective, which is the core of prehistoric archaeology, is a very useful counterbalance to the tendencies to use archaeology to promote nationalist agendas. And one hopes that in the future, prehistoric archaeologists might contribute to building bridges across our fragmented modern landscape and historical time. So, during the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran periods, hunter-gatherers living in the region subsisted on a wide range of plant and animal resources. There is no evidence of domesticated plants or animals during those periods, and the remains of brush huts are the only evidence of architecture. During the Natufian period, constructed architecture and increased elaboration of material culture appear. There is no evidence that agriculture had yet become widespread during the Natufian period. In the early Neolithic period, people lived in villages and finally began to farm a range of cereals and lentils and peas. Subsequently, they also began to domesticate goats. And during the late Neolithic period, the fourth stage in our developmental transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to stabilized, settled, and agricultural communities, is the late Neolithic period. The earliest pottery manufacturer appears during this time, and in most areas the sites of this period are smaller and less densely packed. than those of the end of the early Neolithic. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were fully domesticated at this time. Stage 1 is the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran period. Most sites dating to the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran periods are small hunter-gatherer encampments with few remains other than stone tools and animal bones. The recent discovery of Ohalo, a Kabaran site with excellent preservation of organic remains, has shed new light on that period. Concerning technology, sites belonging to the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran are easily identified on the basis of their characteristic stone tools. The tools from these periods are made mostly on small blades known as bladelets. In the Geometric Kabaran, bladelets are often shaped into geometric forms such as triangles and rectangles. For example, we'll look at the excavation of the Wadi Mataha burial. At this stage of the excavation, the body's legs have been removed. Note how the shoulder bones or the scapula are overlapping. And what does this tell us about the way that the body was buried? We'll discover that in more detail later. In regard to settlements, most sites from the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran periods are the remains of small camps left by highly mobile hunter-gatherers who did not live year-round in one location. Ohalo in northern Israel has provided a unique glimpse of Kabaran occupation site. Soon after it was abandoned, the encampment at Ohalo was submerged beneath the waters of the Sea of Galilee. Because the deposits were not exposed to air, the preservation of organic remains is extremely extraordinary. A recent period of drought led to an unprecedented lowering of lake levels that exposed the site. Archaeologists were able to open up a horizontal 2,000 square foot meter area. And again, see our other videos on horizontal excavations and how they differ from vertical archaeological excavations. And anyways, it unearthed the remains of 6 brush huts that could be traced as shallow oval depressions in the ground between 3 and 4.5 meters in length. And of course, we're talking about brush huts and long houses and towers and the emergence of villages at this time. The artifacts recovered at Ohalo included a large collection of stone tools dominated by retouched bladelets. Tools were also made of bone, mostly in the form of awls. The only personal ornaments recovered were shell beads that had been transported from the Mediterranean seacoast. An adult male was buried near the huts at Ohalo. The skeleton was found lying on its side in a semi-flexed position. No burial items were found with the skeleton. However, the excavator believes that a stone circle found near the burial might have had some ritual significance. Burials from the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran sites are rare. A puzzling Geometric Kabaran burial was excavated at the site of Wadi Mataha in southern Jordan. Wadi Mataha was a very small camp site during that period, so the discovery of a somewhat elaborate burial feature was a surprise. The individual at Wadi Mataha was a young adult male buried with his face pointing down and his arms and legs hog-tied behind his back. A stone bowl with the bottom broken out was found with the human remains, as was a long flint blade. The man's skull had been broken open sometime soon after its death, leaving a large hole slightly above the forehead. On the basis of the discoveries at Ohalo and Wadi Mataha, it is very difficult to understand the spiritual world of the people of the Kabaran and Geometric Kabaran periods. The burial at Ohalo, located within the camp, would fit with a burial ritual that serves to form a spiritual link between a group and its place of habitation. The situation at Wadi Mataha is quite different, however, and it is difficult not to see the burial as a violent event. Art objects from either period are rare. The only known examples are 2 crudely incised pebbles. And of course, we see the Wadi Mataha burial as being a very violent event because the male was not only buried face down, but had his legs and feet tied behind his back with his skull broken open from the top part of the frontal lobe. Concerning domestication, there is no evidence of either animal or plant domestication during the Kabaran or Geometric Kabaran period. The people at Ohalo lived near the edge of a lake with access to a wide range of resources. The plant remains recovered are wild grasses, including wild barley and wild wheat, fruits, nuts, and water plants. The most common mammal bones are from gazelles, but the remains of deer, wild pig, wild goat, hare, red fox, and wild cat are also found. From a single hut, nearly 10,000 fish bones, mostly of carp, were found as well. The remains of over 77 species of birds, including ducks, geese, quail, and birds of prey, were also found at Ohala. And again, Ohala, if I am just to briefly recap, it was a Kabaran site in northern Israel with excellent preservation of organic remains. And then we enter the Natufian stage. Stage number 2, the Natufian societies of the Middle East constructed the earliest stone buildings in this area of the world, and they also developed an impressive range of art objects and personal ornaments. However, there is no evidence that the Natufians domesticated any plants or herd animals. The Natufian settlements at sites such as Malaha were small villages with up to a dozen structures. And again, Malaha was a Natufian period site in northern Israel with the remains of oval stone structures, interestingly enough. And of course, we are still far from understanding the causes underlying the innovations found in the Natufian period. It is possible that an increase in population led to an increase in the size and complexity of settlements, but even if this was the case, we are left to question the reasons for an increase in population. Toward the end of the Natufian, coinciding with a period of climatic stress known as the Younger Dryas, there was a reduction in the size and number of Natufian settlements. The technology of the Natufians shows a great deal of continuity with that of preceding periods. The stone tools continue to be made on small bladelets. The characteristic shape of tools in the Natufian is seen in the crescent-shaped bladelet, known as a lunate. It is assumed that, like the bladelet tools of the preceding periods, lunates served as elements in the hunting tools or as parts of tools made up of many small pieces. At the site of Wadi Hameh in Jordan, a series of bladelets was found mounted in a bone haft of what appears to be a knife or a sickle. Some lunates show a type of luster known as sickle polish, which forms only when stone tools are used to harvest grasses. The Natufians were the first people in the Middle East to invest a great deal of energy in the manufacture of ground stone tools. And among such tools found on Natufian sites are mortars, pestles, and grooved stones known as shaft straighteners, decorated with a simple meander pattern. In some cases, the tools have been found far from the source of the stone, indicating that they were traded across long distances. Long-distance trade is also indicated by the abundance of Red Sea and Mediterranean seashells and shell beads found on Natufian sites, which are often quite distant from the sea. Concerning settlements of the Natufian period, the transition to village life began during the Natufian. Structures consist of undressed stones piled to form walls that are often preserved to a height of up to 1 meter. The structures are ovals or open semicircles. The floors of the structures are covered with refuse, indicating and including stone tools and debris and animal bones. It is hard to imagine these surfaces being used as houses for families, although it is not clear what other function that they may have had. It is usually suggested that the stone walls would have supported a superstructure made of wood and brush. The size of Natufian sites ranges from large villages such as Malaha or Wadi Hameh, with up to a dozen structures, to such much smaller sites. There is considerable debate as to whether these sites were occupied year-round or just at part of the year. During the latter part of the Natufian period, there is a marked reduction in both the number and in the size of the sites. The contraction in Natufian settlements is correlated with a brief period of climatic stress known as the Younger Dryas, which was a global event that is often characterized as a little ice age. Again, the Younger Dryas was a period of global climatic stress that had a significant impact on the Natufian society and its period. A recent research suggests that the onset of the Younger Dryas was extremely rapid and that major shifts in climate would have taken place within a single generation. In the Middle East, the effect of the Younger Dryas was to reduce the area suitable for human occupation. From the change in the size and density of the settlements, it is clear that the Younger Dryas had a significant effect on Natufian society. Burials are commonly found on Natufian sites, often under the floors of houses, and in some cases in a practice that is elaborated in the subsequent Neolithic periods. The skull has been removed prior to burial. Objects found in some Natufian burials include shell necklaces and head coverings. Concerning domestication, before we move on to stage 3, part 2, the early Neolithic, we'll talk about domestication. Unfortunately, it has rarely been possible to recover plant remains from Natufian sites. An important exception is the site of Abu Huraira, located on the upper Euphrates River in Syria. Abu Huraira is a site with multiple levels of occupation that span the sequence from the Natufian through the Neolithic. Excavations in the earliest levels uncovered a culture parallel to the Natufian, but with subtle differences. For example, the houses there were sunken pits rather than built walls. An ambitious program of flotation for burnt seeds at Abu Huraira was richly rewarded with a spectacular assemblage of botanical remains. The analysis of the recovered seeds indicates that the people living there, like the people at Ohalo, exploited a wide range of plants. Such a broad spectrum strategy is not surprising, as it is an effective way for hunter-gatherers to minimize the risk that any particular resource will be temporarily scarce. The plant species do not show clear evidence of having been domesticated, though. With some exceptions, the animal bones found on Natufian sites are dominated by gazelle bones. 80% of the bones identified there were from gazelle. At the same time, Natufians continued to hunt a wide range of animals, including wild sheep, goats, and cattle. At sites such as Malaha, which is located near a marsh, birds were hunted as well. The Natufians did not domesticate any herd animals. Gazelles have actually never been completely domesticated. Interestingly, there is evidence that Natufians had domesticated or at least tamed dogs. At 2 sites, we have Hayonim Terrace and Malaha. Dog skeletons were found buried with human remains. These burials signify that dogs were brought into human society at one point in time. There is also some indication that the snouts of dogs found on Natufian sites are smaller than the snouts of wild dogs. This change in morphology is consistent with the early stages of domestication. Genetic studies support a date for dog domestication in the period between 11,000 and 16,000 years ago. This analysis does not identify where domestication took place, but just suggests a single center of domestication. However, a global study of modern village dogs suggests that dog domestication took place in Central Asia. The genetic study of dogs is complicated by evidence that there was continuous interbreeding between wolves and domesticated dogs. A particularly interesting genetic study compared the entire genome of wolves and dogs to understand what traits were selected for in the process of domestication. There is a clear signal that genes that are related to starch digestion were selected for in domesticated dogs, suggesting that selection for this trait allowed domesticated dogs between 11,000 and 16,000 years ago to thrive on a starch-rich diet that living with people made available. And so thank you. That is the first 2 stages concerning the chronology of the transition to agriculture in the villages of the Middle East from a hunter-gatherer society. We just covered stage 1 and 2 of the Kabarn and geometric Kabarn from 25,000 to 15,000 years ago, and then also the Natufian period from 15,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, which is associated with the time and the date for dog domestication. Next, we will go on to the 3rd stage, and we will talk about the early Neolithic period.